Welcome,
right.
everybody. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have Roger, Claire, and Victor here talking about Contemplating Genesis from Maps of Meaning of Jordan Peterson. Over to you, Roger.
All right, thank you. And so thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Today, we're going to be covering or continuing our coverage of Peterson's dive in his Maps of Meaning theories. And essentially, by now, we've already kind of set up a lot of the basic structures of myth. So now we're going to start using those structures to analyze classical myths that we're already familiar with. And we're going to start with Genesis. Next week's going to be the Buddha. But as you can see, Peterson really loves Genesis, so much so that in future lectures, not in the one that we gave for this one, he talks for an excessive amount. But I did go through it again. There's 4 hours of Peterson going through Genesis that I would recommend to anyone and everyone from his 2017 lectures. But I'm going to pull some of that. So there's going to be a couple of extra points that I'll bring up that maybe you haven't seen in the lecture. So just giving you good fair warning. But before we even get started, just want to give some context as to what tools we'll be using and what our goals are for today. So the toolboxes, the main thing we're going to be using is that myths as phenomenological accounts of human experience, remembering the concepts of order and chaos, as well as the culture and the spirit of the father, and finally the great father and the great mother, and how those work. As far as goals, by the end, we hope to achieve that you understand how flood myths have a common theme, understand the idea of God's way, why consciousness is a prerequisite for being. This one's going to be a little bit of a harder one to explain, but I will do, I hope we can get to it. And how Logos is connected to God and man, how Genesis is relevant and real, is a relevant and real story in many ways. And finally, the viewing and understanding the world as a world of potential. And these are all going to be, the last one's going to be relevant for the next lecture. So I'm kind of trying to set it up. But for today, we're going to be covering quite a lot of ground. And it's kind of an ambitious goal. But today we'll be covering the Genesis story in much more detail. And we'll also be discussing how these kinds of myths work. So right here, I have the next couple slides, and I'm kind of just jump in real quick as to what the goal of each one is. So myth and metaphor, we're going to first dive into the general structure of myths and discuss how and why myths use the language they do. Next, we're going to get more specific and dive into flood myths. So we're going to discuss that specific kind. We'll also explore how many of these myths are appealing to an archetypal truth of the conditions that we always live in. The next one's after that, we're going to explore the solution that is offered by many myths about what is to be done and learned from the flood myths. Essentially, what's the solution to the problem that is posed by the flood myth? And then finally, we're going to use all that roadmap and the moral of those stories to finally dive into Genesis. And with that, I'll be having Victor present a great slideshow as always. And then after that, we're going to jump into the Logos and Eden and how those function, as well as playing with and as God. We're going to finally discuss how the meanings of all the stories line up to make the case for what one of the main points that Genesis is making. And a quick side note, I think Genesis and Logos of Eden, I think I eventually switched them, so they might be slightly out of order. But to start, let's go ahead and start with myth and metaphor. For anyone who is actually reading the book and going through it, this figure should be pretty familiar by now. For some of those that have been coming to the lectures, it might not be as familiar. So I want to explain real quickly what it is that these circles and everything else represents. But essentially, for recap, the circle is essentially the map of the world around you. And all our maps always consist of 3 main components: our idea of where we currently are, our idea of where we want to be, and our idea of how we get from where we are to where we want to be. Now, the reason this is important is because naturally in life, those things never quite play out that way. And just to recap, you're somewhere where you don't want to be, mostly because if you did want to be there, you wouldn't change anything. So once you enact a behavior that you believe will get you to where you should be, it can only go one of two ways. You're either able to predict the environment around you, or you weren't able to predict the environment around you. And either one gives you information. If you do something that you think is going to end in a certain result, and it ends in that result, you're gonna get a predicted outcome, which elicits a promising affect and gives you hope. And this is essentially the "I told you so" effect, right? Anytime, or the "I knew it" effect of like you call something out and you think it's going to happen, and then when it happens, you're like, my map is 100% correct. I can predict how this world works. And as a result, if you can predict how the world works, then naturally you'll end up where you wanted to be or where you were aiming for. The alternative is that there's an outcome that you didn't expect, which then opens up a threat, which then leads to anxiety. And the reason it opens up a threat is if you predicted that something was going to happen and it didn't happen, that means your map's wrong somewhere and you don't know where. So you don't know how blind you actually are. You just know that whatever your map you're using is wrong. Now, if it's wrong in a small way or in a manageable way, you just change your approach, or you change and adapt to a new strategy, and then you can still get to where you want to be. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about what happens when the map is so wrong that it's useless. And that's exactly what this figure is actually showing, is that you have your little map of something, and then anomalous information comes out of nowhere. And even in that saying, there's some hidden information. Out of nowhere tends to normally mean the unknown. It came somewhere you didn't understand or know. As it comes in, it causes one of the three factors to collapse. Either that new information changes what you think changes where you think you are. It changes the viable strategies available to you, or it changes what you think should be. But as long as one of those changes, now the plan is useless. So everything collapses. As it collapses, you descend into chaos, mostly because you don't know what to aim for, you don't know what to do. This also can happen sometimes. You see it a lot with really big life accomplishments, such as graduating from college, getting that job you finally wanted, big achievements that are just achievements. It's right after you finish it, you're in chaos. And the reason you're in chaos is you completed one, but you don't have a second goal to jump to. So now you're just kind of don't know what to do next, and you're just in the same situation. And naturally, to get out of this situation, you then have to change your map, especially if it was a chaotic, if it was something that emerged from chaos that got you there in the first place. And that map is likely not going to be the same. That's why Peterson illustrates these as circles rather than squares compared to the others. It's because you have to change and come up with a new map. And that new map likely is going to have to account for the new or novel information that originally was what broke it in the first place. So all that convoluted background just to essentially explain that this is what this diagram is trying to show. Now let's go into it in a more storytelling aspect. And I'm going to break these down into three different parts. This part here is paradise. And paradise tends to be represented as the place where chaos and order is balanced, and whenever you try to do whatever you're trying to do actually happens, right? And that's, if you imagine what a perfect world would be, that's basically it, right? Where what it is that you want to happen, when you try to make it happen, it happens. It's like, well, that's perfect. That's everything you want. You just have to try to make it happen. And then this part down here is the disintegration into chaos. So normally there's anomalous information that signals that the map is off, and that's what causes the disintegration into chaos, as we covered before. And then the next natural step is seeking a new paradise from the pieces of the old map, the encounter with the anomalous information is often a confrontation with chaos to a new and improved map that accounts for the anomaly. And essentially what Peterson's going to make the case that that this syntax, or this is the grammar of Genesis and of many other myths. But before we even start talking about myths, it's worth kind of highlighting a point that Peterson kind of just notes and then keeps going, but I think is really worth highlighting here, especially if people are not too familiar or just don't buy the argument that well, is why do myths have to be interpreted? Right? Like that tends to open itself to a lot of dangerous and bad ideas, right? And it's oftentimes a criticism. It's actually for example, Sam Harris lays that criticism to Peterson. He's like, it sounds like you could just make stuff up and just put whatever you'd like. And doesn't seem, as a scientist, it doesn't seem very viable. And the case that Peterson is making is that it's not that they're trying to obscure or give some weird, shamanic interpretation of reality or pre-science interpretation of reality, but rather that the symbols they use have a metaphorical richness that allows them to convey multiple truths at once with incredible depth, even if they're very, very short. In other words, in using metaphor, they're capturing multiple patterns, and you can interpret it in multiple ways, all of which are valuable and viable. And that's the first one, is that it's the myths and metaphors are kind of trying to be able to encapsulate multiple layers all at once. The second one is the limits of language. When you're saying something profound, you use the best language that's accessible to you, and you approach when you approach an extremely profound topic, you're dealing with images and symbols that are just as profound and complex. And another way of saying that is essentially when you're discussing parts of reality that are not obviously understood, you're working in a domain where our language hasn't evolved to discuss those things directly, right? If we're talking about what is reality, but we can't really encounter it, you can't even say anything about it. There's no language that exists to even deal with those things. So if the target of what you're talking about is reality, then the language has to stretch to its limits of our ability to understand it. So in other words, the best way to understand myths, you can see them as artistic attempts to portray the human condition and the human behavior and philosophy that comes as a consequence of that condition. And this was something that we actually covered a little bit earlier when we were talking about the Great Mother and the Great Father, because it's another great example of how humans attempt to understand what we don't know by using what we do know. Hence why metaphors are so common in myths, because we're constantly trying to use it as a way to go around the fact that we might not have exact knowledge that we can deal with these things. So hence, that's why a lot of myths are often imagistic and dramatic rather than logical, rational, and explicit. Or to quote Alan Watts, a myth is an image, a concrete image in terms of which the man makes sense of the world. So keeping that idea and that definition of a myth in mind, and actually before, Claire, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
This is a particular, he says this in a very poignant way in this section. And I like this idea of this sort of artistic endeavor to portray reality, because that's really what these images evoke, is that they are so incomprehensible. They're so complex. The metaphor is so just sort of Alice in Wonderland, out of this world beyond, but that herein lies the sort of art of it. And so I think when you think about this sort of paradise lost and the reintegration, that's a story that Peterson tells in a lot of really simple ways, right? Like the obvious one is the adulterous wife, right? Where your whole life sort of falls apart and you realize your entire map was wrong. The example he uses in the beginning of the book is like getting fired from a job, and not only getting fired, but your boss telling you, hey, you're horrible at this. Like, you are not cut out for this. These experiences they're simple to us. I mean, those are lived experiences. But when you combine all of reality, all of the potential experiences of the kind of paradise lost and reintegrations, that is why these stories require sort of the depth of metaphor and the kind of insane allusions that they allude to.
Right. So keeping that conceptualization of myth in mind, and keeping what it is that myth is actually trying to do. If we remember the last time we talked about the Great Father and how when he's destroyed or corrupted, the benevolent mother turns into the devouring or destructive mother. This was one of the main themes of the Mesopotamian myth, if you remember. So, God Apsu and Tiamat join in sexual congress and give birth to new gods. These new gods, they're kind of wild and crazy, and they accidentally kill Apsu, and Tiamat essentially returns and comes back for revenge. But before we jump into how to prevent this from happening, we have to discuss how myths often represent this exact problem. So a lot of times those myths are referred to as flood myths. So because myths tend to be very profound, as we mentioned earlier with our language, you can actually interpret myths and even myth structure in multiple ways. So I'm going to try something here where I'll essentially describe the same structure using 3 different lenses to kind of highlight the type of story we're talking about and the implications within those stories. So the first one's going to be from a religious perspective, the flood myth from a religious perspective. This one's pretty straightforward, and I'm sure it's going to sound familiar to a lot of different stories. The first main point, the gods or God is or are pissed. You've done something to upset them. Something powerful is not okay with what is currently going on or what's happening. And more importantly, you've crossed some expectation that God himself had of you, either sin or decadence or something of the nature. The correct way was not followed. So these people have been sinners and they're not following God's way. God seeks vengeance or punishes the sinners. As a result of their actions, God punishes them often with a flood or a natural disaster. Peterson notes from I can't remember the current research, I just blanked on it, but that this is very common except for in Africa. But the presumption is that in Africa, they use different things, mostly because there wasn't as much water. So representing, that God flooded all of, a desert might not be the most convincing story in that sense, in that setting. But so that's one way to look at the flood myth. Another way is symbolically, and I'm going to be using the symbols that Peterson has set up of chaos and order and the Great Mother and Great Father. You can see this also as chaos is held at bay only if order is sustained. Order is the source of safety, the known, the predictable domain. And this is here where the Tiamat and Apsu interlocked in lovemaking is essentially what's happening, right? They're both holding each other and containing each other. And it's only when that is happening that there's a creative aspect to the relationship. If order is not maintained, the Great Father dies and order collapses, meaning that the current order of things will not sustain itself. Entropy will naturally make all things that are orderly decay. And one example that Peterson often gives is an attack helicopter. And essentially he highlights that something as complex as an attack helicopter won't just sit there and be ready whenever you need it. It takes 6 hours of maintenance for 1 hour of flight. So in other words, just to keep that thing to be the same and to be what it should be requires a lot of work to fight against all the entropic forces that are slowly decaying that system. Or another example that he often uses is the laptop example, where you may buy a laptop and it's a laptop for the first 3 or 4 or 5 years, but a 10-year-old laptop is pretty useless pretty quickly. And then the question becomes like, well, is that even a laptop or is it just a useless box that you don't do anything with, but you also feel weird throwing away because technically it still works, but it doesn't function as a laptop anymore. So the system is always naturally decaying. And on top of that, another reason is that another reason that naturally occurs is that the environment is constantly shifting. So the order that was good 100 years ago may be too outdated. And the quickest and easiest way I can highlight this is, let's just say Because of all the turmoil we currently are having, someone has the idea of like, hey, guys, why don't we just change all the rules back to what we had them 100 years ago, right? Like it worked better back then. Let's just go ahead and switch it back 100 years ago. Immediately, you can see why that's a very bad idea and that's not a viable one, right? It's like the environment has changed so much that what our ancestors had adapted to it doesn't resemble any of the problems that we currently have today. So reverting to that strategy isn't going to work. The world is constantly changing and we're constantly having to adapt with it in every sense of society. So hence, here's why in the Mesopotamian myth, the metaphor is that we inhabit the body of our dead father, right? Our culture was the strategy that our forefathers used to get us to this point. But if we do not address the fact that our strategies may not be working, we will pay the price. And then finally, upon the death of order, chaos comes and wipes you out. Once a society has abandoned its social norms, the actors within that society can be classified as representations of chaos to one another. And a good example of this, for example, without getting too political, is the riots that we've seen over the past year and political party association, right? But both sides tend to more fear the people that are breaking the social norms on the other side. That's what's scary, right? But then that's associated with the entire party. And then what very quickly starts to become is that society becomes unpredictable. Trust becomes impossible because you can't simplify others enough to interact with them. You can't just assume or presume that they are going to be what society says they should be. Since you see a lot more deviance, it starts to bring a lot more into question, and chaos starts to manifest itself within every single individual. The order that the king offered may begin to dissolve, and chaos comes and washes away those who did not do what needed to be done. So that's a symbolic representation of the exact same thing that was religious. Now, let's take a look at it in a more rational sense. Society requires that we follow emergent morality. So remembering the theory of an equilibrated state and how certain games naturally arise whenever any animals are social, and that from that game arise certain rules. Well, for animals to be social, they must engage in a game where their emotions and motivations are at least considered enough for the game to continue. The idea that we're playing a stable game the idea is that we've played this stable game for so long that the game became a part of the evolutionary environment, meaning that we evolved to play this game. That game keeps society intact and can be seen as behavior that maintains the social structure. So therefore, the next one is to deviate significantly from that is to risk annihilation. The following of these rules is what makes the players in the game willing to play. If enough people stop obeying the rules, the game dissolves. A couple of examples is, why don't we like cheaters in almost any context? Why are cheaters almost always seen as like, unless you're the one cheating, right? Because then if you're the one cheating, it's pretty fun and pretty advantageous. But if you're playing against a cheater, you're likely not going to want to play. Or another question that can often be asked is, look, right now, a lot of the richest people in the world don't pay taxes. How much would that have to grow before you would stop paying taxes? You know, let's say if instead of the top 1%, it was the top 10% or 20% or 50%. How far would it have to go before you say, you know what, I don't think anyone's enforcing this kind of stuff. I'm not going to pay either. But the point, it doesn't matter what that level is. The point is that at certain points, the game just naturally dissolves once people start breaking these rules, the expectation of those rules. And then if you do not do what is needed to maintain the system you are in, you are risking the system itself. If the morality that is maintaining order is deviated from enough, the game stops being worth playing. In other words, we're in a constant lifelong fight against entropy and against apathy. The culture and society that we were gifted by our forefathers is only here because we're able to maintain the system well enough to get to this point. There's no guarantee that it'll continue. And in fact, it's quite inclined to do the opposite and either collapse or corrupt. So, Claire, do you have any points on this?
There's a really important, it's a lot, but, and I think that the importance here is this sort of dualism of what's causing the Great Flood, right? That there is a cause here. Yes, it's the decrepitude of the world and the natural kind of devolution of culture. And Peterson says that just by sort of the mere fact that culture exists, that it lives and it produces, it will naturally deteriorate. So yes, you have that, but that's always happening. But when you add that to the sins of man, and as you're describing them here, that's not vices, that is man and the individual consciously removing themselves from their responsibility to confront that anomaly, to play the game. When you combine those two things, then you're getting the Great Flood. Then there is the necessity to sort of wipe these things out. And then, of course, just to add some complexity on top of that, those two things are really connected and are kind of form one. And we'll get into that as we go into Genesis. But I think that sort of dual element really stuck with me today.
Right, and this, for anyone curious, is also the solution to the previous one of the tyrannical king, right? But working in an opposite way. Whereas the flood myth tends to be a collapse of order, the tyrannical king tends to be too much order. But they both function, they both happen for the same reason, and the same reason is the hero. To find a solution for that is that we can call on the heroes such as Horus or Simba from The Lion King, for example, and take our responsibility to the thing that allowed us to grow within its protected walls. And this is the responsibility to the state. So before, I've tried to explain it in several different lenses, but let's see if we can just get it clearly out of what exactly the problem is. The problem that we face is that the systems that we depend upon have the capacity to collapse due to several reasons. The first, decay. The system becomes naturally outdated and collapses over time. The second, environment. The environment that the system is adapted to is constantly changing and therefore constantly requiring novel adaptations and updating. And three, and this is what Peterson highlights, is the human tendency to abandon responsibility of things. It's the lack of effect in which that actual lack of action in effect speeds up the natural decay of the system. So because people aren't willing to take that responsibility, aren't willing to act and do what they should do as a response, the decay that naturally is happening is actually sped up because of that dereliction of responsibility. So what exactly is the solution here for this flood myth? Well, it's several steps. The first is confronting manifestations of chaos. In other words, every member of society must be socialized. It's one of the requirements to live in a society is you have to be socialized. And what that means is you're essentially given and forced to some extent, take a certain kind of programming with certain embedded solutions within it. However, when a member of that society encounters an anomaly that they can't address, in other words, something like your culture didn't teach you how to deal with this problem, or you don't have a solution from your own culture, then it's your responsibility morally as a member of that society to actually confront that thing you don't know what to do with. And so that's the first step, and it's the first place where you can fail, because a lot of us might just ignore it, right? If it looks like a lot of work, nah, I'm good. I don't want to deal with that. If it might come at a cost to us, like, nah, I'm not willing to risk my job for that, right? So once there's an anomaly, the first place you can fail is not confronting it. But that is the first requirement. The second requirement is solving it, or at least attempting to solve it. If possible, the member of the society should attempt to solve the problem, whatever that problem may be. If you solve the problem well enough, you solve the problem for everyone. That's kind of a Jungian, it's a paraphrase of a Jungian quote, that the idea is, if there's a problem, there's a way to find a solution that solves it for the right now, for that one problem. But there's also solutions that solve every iteration of that problem. Does that make sense? So there's a difference between solving what does my girlfriend want right now and solving, oh, if I talk to my girlfriend this way, I can find out what she wants anytime I want. And that solves every problem of that problem. But even if you don't solve it, your failures are still important information that could help someone else who is trying to solve it. So even if you fail, trying to do it is just as important and just as morally important for the sustaining of order. And then the next step is communicating novel information. In other words, if the solution is found, or even if only the problem is better understood, it must be communicated to others. It must be shared. An enlightened Buddha is no good if he keeps his enlightenment or her enlightenment to themselves, right? The whole point is to share it with everyone else. And you'll also see that these solutions are reflected within the hero myth. The boon is only useful if the boon is returned to the community or returned to the original place. And finally, as a result of doing these steps, that is what updates the system. Through communication, the problem can be better understood, the solution can better be distributed, and the system as a whole can be updated. So we can see that this solution's also represented in the Illuminalish. Tiamat comes after the death of Apsu and rains terror on the gods. Marduk, who can see in every direction and speaks fire, captures and cuts Tiamat up, using the pieces to create the world. So in other words, Tiamat comes in and Marduk captures her, cuts her up into pieces, and essentially through the metaphor of analyzing, is able to tear those pieces of chaos and create useful things from them and things that actually make the society better. Claire, did you have anything to add before I jump on?
No.
Nope. All right. So for this next one, so just like in the Numa Elish, Peterson uses Genesis as his example of a paradise lost and man's struggle to regain it. As we will see, the story doesn't just cover the collapse of order and its attempt to regain it, but also serves as a metaphor for how humans came to exist and the fundamental problems of the human condition. And for that part, we'll switch to Victor. I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right, so picking up where Roger left off, we looked at two mythological stories, Tiamat, Apsu, Marduk, and Osiris, Isis, and Horus one, right? So, forward. Okay, so now for this session, let's look at Genesis story, and going forward, maybe in the next one, let's look at Buddha's enlightenment. Not to bore you, but just to wrap up, Tiamat, Apsu, and Marduk. It's Tiamat representation of chaos and Apsu representation of order come together, and they give rise to elder gods. Elder gods go, and Apsu, Tiamat gets mad and she comes back. And Marduk, who has this special capability of looking at everything, note that there is an emphasis on the eye. He comes and he brings in the new order. Similarly, in Osiris and Isis story, it's the same thing. But in this case, it's Osiris, the existing order, and his brother Seth, representing the evil brother. So he ends Osiris, he cuts him into pieces and distributes across the state. And his counterpart, Isis, gets mad, and they both give rise to Horus. Horus goes fight Seth, and Seth goes back and gives his father the eye, and then brings in the new order. Essentially, what do we have here? We have a great mother, the representation of Tiamat and Isis, great father, in the representation of Apsu and Osiris. Give me a second. Osiris, and they come together and give rise to great son. So in the form of Marduk and Horus. So now taking out the character representation, let's boil down a little bit. What do we have in Great Mother? We have a good part and a bad part. They are bivalent in nature. Same thing with Great Father. There is a good side of Great Father, a protective side, and at the same time, there is a tyrannical side. And the great son's job, responsibility is to take out the bad and bring in the new good. And now taking out the characters, this is essential boiled down version of any great myth. There's chaos, bivalent nature, there's order, bivalent nature. And the order, the new order that comes in, that actually sees through these good and bad, and then it separates these two. So that is the essential myth. Now let's look at Genesis story. Here, Genesis story, it actually is of two parts. One is creation of cosmos and creation of humans, or it gets more personal right after that. But for tonight, let's just look at creation of cosmos. So it goes like this. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Let's focus on the word void. Void in Hebrew, it means tehom. Also, tehom is the word that is derived from the word temat. And it also relates to the word kehom, from which the word chaos came. So that's the meaning of void. And next, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. So now there are some things to see here. There are some patterns. There is some duality going here. The duality of heaven and earth, and deep and above, earth and water, those kinds of things. So let's come to the dualities in a minute, but let's just note that there is a sense of duality here. And the cosmos comes into existence with this particular word, the third verse in Genesis chapter, book of Genesis chapter 1. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. So now you can also see a duality here. So looking at the dualities, we actually started with the idea of void, where we have no form at all. And then there's a heaven and earth, there's a deep below, and up above, there's light and darkness. So these are the dualities that are in play for the cosmos to come into existence. We started with void, and there is some cosmos got created. So this is how cosmos is created. And there are a couple of things to discuss here. So this, any myth is not, any creation myth is not an objective retelling of materialistic emergence. In other words, it's not a mythic representation of Big Bang theory. It's not an explanation of how the materialistic things came into existence. But it's a story of nature of human experience of reality. It's more of something emerging in the human. So, but here we use the word experience. A human experience, for a human to experience something, that human needs a particular kind of faculty. And that faculty is actually consciousness. When you have a certain consciousness, you can see and experience the reality. So that in that regard, it explicitly stresses on the idea of individual consciousness. And without consciousness, there would be no segregated entities, that you cannot see things differently, and therefore no being. Being is to see things differently and to categorize things. And to conclude, Genesis story puts human consciousness at the center of human cosmos. And that's it from me.
Thank you. All right, let me jump right back on here. So this was going to be a little bit difficult, because as Victor was explaining, that there's this idea between objective truth and subjective truth. And kind of how you can reconcile these two and how they should be understood. And for this, for a lot of people who are very, very science driven, this can sometimes be a hard idea to wrap your head around. For me, like it took me a long time to actually wrap my head around what it was that they're trying to make. Because there's a lot of ways to conceptualize reality. One common one is to conceptualize the matrix of things as the source of everything. And this kind of tends to be, as Victor alluded to, the Big Bang Theory perspective of reality, of the physical world, and we're just kind of a side effect of that physical world. And Peterson points out that though that is a fair way to look at the world, there's another way to look at it that's actually just as fair. And it's the exact inverse of that. That the first and foremost, the thing that you have is your psyche, is consciousness. And everything else, every other possible theory is first and foremost derived from that consciousness. And in religious thinking, the idea is often that the interaction between the matrix, the things, or what the world is, the world that was formless in the beginning, and the logos is actually what creates being. And it's the logos' ability to change chaos, tahom, or derivative of tiamat, into order that allows there to be anything at all. That is to say that without consciousness, the world loses its form. This is highlighted by the old Zen saying of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And if you think about that without a goal, you don't really understand what that even means. It seems quite obvious that it would make a sound. But if you consider sound here as being a sensation, because that is kind of what we mean by sound normally, then the vibrations that would then vibrate our eardrums, that would then be interpreted by our consciousness as sound, would occur. But without consciousness to interact with it, there would be no sound. And just like sound, this applies to everything that can be considered being. And with these kind of ideas, I'm stretching myself to my limit. So I'm going to lean on Jung, and it reminded me of a quote, and I spent some time looking for it, but I'm glad I found it because I think he makes the case way better than I ever could. And this is a modern man in search of a soul when he's talking about the material and the spiritual aspects, which spiritual for him, he sees them as psychic events. The conflict of the material and the spiritual aspect of life only shows that the psychic is in the last resort an incomprehensible something. Without a doubt, psychic happenings constitute our only immediate experience. All that I experience is psychic. Even physical pain is a psychic event that belongs to my experience. My sense impressions, for all that they force upon me on the world of impenetrable objects, impenetrable objects occupying space, are psychic images. And these alone are my immediate experience, for they alone are the immediate object of my consciousness. My own psyche even transforms and falsifies reality. And it does this to such a degree that I must resort to artificial means to determine what things are like apart from myself. Then I discover that the tone is a vibration of the air of such and such frequency, or that a color is a wavelength of light of such and such length. We are in all truth so enclosed by psychic images that we cannot penetrate to the essence of things external to ourselves. All our knowledge is conditioned by the psyche, which, because it alone is immediate, it's superlatively real. Here, there is a reality to which the psychologist can appeal to, namely psychic reality. So considering that conceptualization of reality, that's more what's being talked here, is that if there is no consciousness, for example, another way of thinking about this, if there is no consciousness, what exactly would time look like if humans are the ones that are perceiving time? It's like, how would that function then? How would that even work if there is no consciousness that is actually perceiving the time as passing by? Another way you can think of it is going to more classical philosophy. Without consciousness, reality doesn't seem to exist. One idea is, for example, the cogito ergo sum from Rene Descartes, the idea of him kind of breaking down, well, what can I know that I believe, that what can I know that I know, right? And he, takes out religion and reality and all these other ideas. He's basically saying like, well, I could just be dreaming. I could be, he essentially puts doubt on almost everything. And then he's trying to figure out what is the one thing that I know I can't doubt. And eventually he gets to the point where he says, well, I know that somebody is thinking, I know I can't doubt, or that something is having those thoughts. So therefore, I think, therefore I am. It's the one thing that I know, is that whatever the hell this consciousness is, that's the one thing I know. And that also works great to highlight the point that if you aren't thinking, if you don't have consciousness, then what is it that actually exists? What is it that can even be said to be known? Or if you want to take another philosophical example, would be bundle theory from David Hume, who essentially says, look, every single thing that you point to, you presume that there's something under the thing that you're pointing to. Like, for example, you will likely say that there's a cup in my hand, but if you take away all the sense data that makes this cup, what is left? Right? If you take all the information that your consciousness is giving you, what can you even conceptualize about this cup? And for him, he kind of makes the point that's like, well, then it just seems like it's nothing but a collection of stimuli that you're building together. But it also goes to the exact same point. It seems to be more that consciousness is what's creating the very forms that you yourself perceive. So then what happens to being when that consciousness doesn't exist? So in Genesis, that's exactly what's being communicated. The Logos speaks the world into being from chaos, and it separates the world and separates light from dark and deems the light as good, which I also find kind of funny because we naturally are conscious when the sun is out and we require the sun to see, and seeing is one of the most valuable traits humans have. Like the only thing that I think that beats us are, falcons and certain birds. So it seems pretty good that like our God would deem that as a good thing, that there's light. And so this idea is essentially that when the logos enters whatever the matrix is, that's actually what separates everything from, what allows us to separate everything from everything else. It's our own restrictions that allows us to actually deviate things. Another fun example that you can try is just look around right now, wherever you are, and kind of ease your gaze to not focus on anything. And what you'll notice is, first and foremost, the things that seem to stick out most to you are things that are grabbable. And that's likely because we evolved to be able to grab things. And then if you pay more attention, you'll start to pay attention to other things that are also in the room, but that you didn't really pay attention to, such as your floor, the ceiling, the fact that you're in an apartment, the window that you can't grab. But first and foremost, the main things that seem to have more valence are the things that fit in your hand. Now, that reality doesn't necessitate that that's actually reality. It necessitates that that's a reality that's practical for you. Right? So then what, and that's kind of more the domain where we're talking about. But moving past that for a little bit, I think we might come back to it. God then creates the humans that eat from, I'm going to jump a little bit into the human aspect too. God then creates these humans that eat from the tree of knowledge. And that's kind of the climax of the story, right? They've eaten from this tree they weren't supposed to, and they were promised powers of God, essentially, that if they ate it, they would either live forever or at least have powers similar to God, which the point of the story is that, like, well, you did get powers from God, but it may not have been what you wanted. Because in eating it, the scales of our eyes fall and we can see more like gods. And what exactly does that mean, to be able to see more like gods? Well, Peterson has a theory, and he essentially says it's time. That's what we were able to see. At some point in our evolution, we learned to perceive time, and the world changed in a very weird way. Because once you learn time, once you start to understand the fourth dimension, you start to see that you're actually very finite in that dimension. You're extremely limited. And because you're extremely limited, you also become self-aware as to the fragility of your life and all the possible dangers that come from it. And one perspective that you can take on this story is read it as a complete tragedy, as a, almost a ghost in the machine type of tragedy, where we woke up, we're fallen creatures who attained a power of gods, but not their wisdom. The self-conscious logos of the individual that allows them to see the world as objects, as Peterson points out, that as well as themselves as objects, that's what gives value to the world, right? The consciousness outside of an object doesn't really give value to the world, but once it's inside the object, it has a vested interest, right? Consciousness has a vested interest in what we are, what we are embodied in. And that's actually what changes and gives it value. And that's when we become moral creatures. That's when we get to choose things rather than just be unconscious like all the other animals seem to somewhat be. And it's through this awareness of ourselves and the reality around us that we become aware of our limitations, our mortality, and our desires. And as a result, the objective and the subjective must both still exist constantly, but not match. And we constantly suffer from that reality. And as we mentioned earlier of those mapping, that's essentially what we're constantly trying to do. We're constantly trying to keep up with the reality that's constantly transforming and changing, and we can't keep up. And it's interesting because this is also described as our fall from grace with God, as our lack of ability to be able to walk with God. Well, that makes perfect sense if you conceptualize God as just reality or the totality of everything else. And then you consider the fact that, once you have to choose to walk that way, it's not as easy. It's not an intuitive, non-thinking process. And so for Peterson, he kind of points out that when the logos is extended to the object, to something that is concrete, it makes human existence finally problematic. And what he means by that is we can't go back. Once we woke up, we can't go back. There's no putting this genie back in the bottle. Once we become conscious, once we're aware of our death, once we're aware of our mortality, of our finitude, we can't forget that. Right. So and Peterson also points out that this is noted as a transformation in the nature of experience that has essentially cosmic significance. It changes the entire world. So going to move forward now to the Garden of Eden. What exactly is that? Why a garden, or what is the point of all this? So it represents several things. One is it's a representation of what humans actually need. It is, as a location, a place of nature and culture in perfect harmony, in perfect balance. It's also representative of what humans need. It is our being's perfect setting. That setting being a place where order and chaos, a place of order in which chaos is controlled but thriving, and order is safe but not imposing. It's an archetypically comforting idea. It's a place that transcends what you would find in nature and what you would find in culture, right? That's essentially why we love gardens. It's why there's something naturally calming when you're walking in those peaceful parks. It's because it's like, nah, this isn't chaos. This isn't a jungle, right? And anyone who's ever walked through an actual jungle, it's not as peaceful or calm. Like there's a lot of weird, crazy things going on around you and you have no idea what to do about it. But when it's, there's clearings and everything's kind of predictable and safe, but still controlled and natural, we find that very appealing naturally. So it's on one end, it's what we need. It's also who we are, because much like a garden, we are also the product of culture and nature. Every aspect of you is that, right? From the beginning of life to you as an iteration of that chain of life, it is a mixture of the culture and nature being combined to the point of you being the end result of that. And also what we were. Eden represents when we were in sync with the rest of reality, when we were unaware of ourselves and were similar to animals. In other words, when we walked with God and we were in harmony. Once we became aware, we could no longer live in a place where nature and culture were perfectly synced, right? Claire, do you want to jump in? Or
just to say that, if you guys are finding these concepts complex, that's because I mean, it does not get much more complex than this in terms of the understanding of both objective and subjective truth as being equal and being equally true. It's really mind-boggling, and Peterson says as much, right? Like this is absolutely complex, but I think that the way you've articulated it as, you know, without consciousness to be the observer first, nothing else comes, right? That the consciousness becomes this sort of precondition for any being itself or any reality itself. And in this way, you know, the subject and the object are one. So I think you put it beautifully, Roger.
Right. And yeah, we'll hit a little bit more on the last slide about that aspect. But I also wanted to kind of highlight that I understand how it a lot of times sounds with the subjective reality, but you also have to consider that you can still, that the point is that you should rise the value of subjective reality. That doesn't mean you have to lower the value of objective reality. It's not that science is invalid. It's simply that science only gives us information that's relevant to a certain domain, but all the domains that a lot of the domains that we care about actually comes from the more subjective aspect of our psyches, and just kind of understanding that wholeness aspect, which is you know, constant in Jung philosophy of contradictions forming a whole. So now we're going to jump real quick into some of these. I think I might skip for sake of time. How are we doing? Yeah, for sake of time, I might skip some of these because they do go quite long. But essentially, I just wanted to talk about some of the aspects of the story of the Garden of Eden and kind of just highlight what Peterson's point is, especially when he uses evolutionary psychology to kind of illuminate what these things might be pointing to and what our past might have actually contained. The first is, why is there a tree? Why is there a tree? Why is that the case? You know, it seems kind of strange. And from an evolutionary perspective, that's actually where we lived. That's where we evolved. That's what our platform came from. And in those trees, one of our main predators were snakes. And those trees also had fruits, and we were primarily fruit eaters. And we know this because our color vision actually evolved to detect ripe fruit. That's why we're really good at detecting differences between green and red. And apart from that, there's also multiple other levels of what a tree can signify. First, there's the actual tree that we actually, you know, evolved on. Then there's the metaphorical tree that produced the fruit, that produced the change for us to evolve in, because essentially this is a story about us becoming self-conscious. And then finally, there's the world tree, which I'm definitely not going to touch with tenfold pole because that's a whole another spiel, but I highly recommend anyone who is interested in that aspect of this story to go check out Peterson's Maps of Meaning lectures from 2017, the ones that are called Genesis 1 and 2, because he has 4 hours of him just talking about this. But there are a couple of highlights I wanted to talk about. One is, why is it Eve who tempts Adam? And Peterson kind of notes that this is kind of an enticement motif, right? It's an aspect of the woman or the female first enticing the male into something. And Peterson notes that, well, it's because that's something that only humans do. Normally, most humans share food. Like it's natural with us to share food. And almost all other animals share food, at most mother to child, and sometimes maybe within kin. But humans will share it with strangers. We'll share it, you know, as a starting offering. So much so that if you isolate us, and I think quarantine's been a great example of that, if we're isolated and we're eating alone, our eating habits greatly start to become problematic because we don't regulate ourselves as well. And Peterson also notes that the relationship between fruit, women, and consciousness is so tight that even many of the things that men find beautiful about women are fruit-like. So this can be from color to a lot of other things that I'm not going to say. But you can also see these examples even in women's makeup ads, right? A lot of times there's all these fruit aspects, but it's not just a reference to the taste of the makeup, but also to the color that they're representing. It's oftentimes fruit and food that's also associated with it. And so why did Eve eat the fruit first? Well, if you remember that action, it's supposed to be a representation of becoming self-conscious. And Peterson points out that women had to deal with being smaller than men and easily damaged. And even more, and to complicate matters, they then also had to deal with children that were even smaller and even more easily damaged. So Peterson believes that women are hardwired to the infant child dyad and not just to the female herself. And it may be why it may be one of the possible explanations why women tend to, on average, have be more sensitive to negative emotion and have higher agreeableness than men. It's because they're adapted to be able to manage their reality that they would have to have survived to even evolve to this point. And he points also out that humans have the longest time for raising a child. And there's two theories here as to how women made men self-conscious. The first is, well, they made men aware of the vulnerability of the female and the child. And through that constant aspect, made men more aware of the moral imposition that a child puts on both the woman and the responsibility that could be there. And he notes, like, look, that may seem pretty obvious to us now, but it's not obvious in the animal kingdom. There's plenty of animals that don't act in that behavior. But another one that for me is much more convincing is that they also became harsher judges, because if they become self-conscious, if they become self-aware of their vulnerability and understand how dangerous men can be, they become picky. And it's one of the things that from mate selection that differentiates us from a lot of other species is that women are very picky with their mates. And Peterson even notes that studies have shown that women tend to judge 85% of men on dating apps as below average, which unfortunately is not how average works. So that means that they tend to select for as high as they can. And as women become more selective, they start to value status, which status among men starts to become the scaffolding for the hierarchy. So you can already start to see that as self-conscious rises, there's a natural implication that they're going to be more picky. If they're more picky, then the ones that they're going to choose are the ones that have the most access to the most things, or at least that are the best in whatever it is that the woman is looking for, which then is going to cause a competition that then is a virtuous cycle that just creates the hierarchy naturally. Or at least that's the argument he's trying to make. So keeping this evolutionary lens, this leads us to, I'm trying to see what I can cut out. All right, I'll cut out these parts. To the aspect of why can they see that they're naked when they do take that fruit? And Peterson notes two things. One is, well, naturally, there's a sexual aspect to it because one is male, one is female, and they both seem to be terrified that the other person can see them. And he points out that that's actually one of the most natural fears that we all have. One of the most common nightmares that people have is being naked, but also the fear of rejection. Anyone who's, ever had sex knows that the one time you don't want to be rejected is when your clothes first come off. That is when you are most vulnerable. That is when you are presenting your true being to this other person. And a rejection at that point is, it's catastrophic. And it's also the more biological aspect of we stand up straight. All our vulnerable organs are fully exposed to whatever it is that we're facing. So there's a sense of vulnerability of safety too. And actually, I'll skip the exiled and damned for now. And if we have time, we can go back to it. But another thing that Peterson points out is why did the fruit of give them knowledge of good and evil? How did they learn the difference between good and evil? Well, once you attain self-consciousness and you become aware of your vulnerability and of all the things that you wouldn't want to happen to you, you can then use that knowledge to infer what others would not like to be done to them. And then finally, you can do things to others for the exact reason that it's something that you do know that they would not want to happen to them, right? That becomes a logical step that you can make pretty quickly and pretty easily once you realize that you are vulnerable. And, examples of those are everywhere. So what this is pointing out is that at some point in our history, there had to have been a change. It is where the things that make us different from everything else was first attained. Like Icarus, illumination was stolen from the gods, and it made us godlike. So it's worth contemplating. What does this mean? And before I start, Claire, do you have anything you want to jump on for the...
No, I mean, there's so much to unpack
Right,
there.
yeah, there's
and
a lot.
That's why we started with what we were saying around that these are just unbearably complex symbols, and they're intended to be as such. And every little element of these stories can be unpacked. So we'll just leave it there because we could talk forever.
Fair enough. All right, and kind of for the last aspect to kind of put a cap on this lecture, because he does end on in an equally complex note. He kind of points out that's like, well, why would a god do this? What's the logical narrative with all this other myth set up? Why would then a god do this? And he brings back that idea, that Jewish idea of, well, what is it that if a god has everything, what does he lack? And what he lacks is limitation, right? So therefore, the absolute needs a point of reflection in the limited being to actually spring into some kind of defined actuality. Because the idea is, for there to be a totality, there has to be something that can actually define it as a totality. So that the being itself becomes the interplay between the necessary limitations of the finite and the transcendent reality of the absolute. So God and man are twins in that they're dependent on each other for their defined being. And Peterson points that, so from that perspective, from that mythological perspective, being has the same nature as a game, and all games have rules. There are these things that you can do while playing these games, but there's also things you can't do. And the games can't exist without limitations, and those limitations give rise to new and diverse forms. Similar to the relationship between Atman is Brahman, or you are God. This perspective kind of gives you this idea that you are gods, that everyone is God, and that the totality is also God, right? And what's funny about this is like the Atman is Brahman is from the more Hindu religion of this idea of a totality of the Godhead. So it's worth considering then, in this perspective, what sorts of gods are we? And the first thing from the Christian perspective that we would know is, well, we're made in his image. And Peterson points out, you could take this as we look like him, the old man in the sky, kind of sky daddy that will take care of us. Or it could mean the same thing that gives rise to order as a consequence of its confrontation with chaos is the thing that characterizes us as humans. In other words, that is the thing that makes us godlike. So within each human being, there's an actual spark of divinity. There's actual divinity in it. And that the divinity in humans within time and space is what actually keeps the cosmos generating. It's what keeps the cosmos existing in the way, at least, that we conceptualize it. Another aspect that's godlike is our dominion over the animals, right? And Peterson also just notes that it's like, well, this isn't a command or things we should do. It's just a description. We're smarter than any of the other animals. They're all pretty dumb by comparison to us, right? They're not even a challenge. Quite quickly, we're able to take control of the world, relatively speaking. But the one that is the most powerful, or at least most convincing personally for me, is the power over potential. And for that, Peterson kind of points out that we can think of the world as a pool of potential where there's multiple worlds that could come to existence, but none of them actually do exist. We seem to be the only creatures, or at least the best creatures by a lot, to be able to actually see a potential and manifest it by choice. It is this very capability that gives us the spark of divinity. So if that's the case, what is it that you're attempting to change the world into? So for the next couple of lectures, we're going to be exploring paradise and dystopia, as well as why and how people use these powers to bring about both. So thank you very much.
Right. Wonderful. So can we stop sharing? Oh, thanks. So folks, what we're going to do is that there's just so much here that we are going to go directly into the breakout rooms, discuss amongst ourselves, and then come back. And there we can talk about our takeaways and put the questions down. So then we can discuss all of them together. Okay, so we'll vet the questions through the breakout rooms and then come back to discuss them. Starting the breakout rooms now. Okay. All right, folks, so it's time for takeaways. And you can also ask questions. Roger, Claire, Victor, and I will keep track of everything that you say. And we will pick common themes that come out from this and go for it. Now, it is going to be voluntary. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to talk about your takeaways and the big questions that you have. Let's start with David. David, go ahead.
So just again, Roger, Claire, and Victor, fantastic presentation. You took a topic and made it extremely something that you need to think about. And I mean, I'll probably try to be unpacking this for weeks, but some really interesting concepts. We had a great breakout group. And again, I love the format that you've created here, Shrikant, because not only the presentation, but it's the interaction with the people, the participants that really make this whole dynamics work. But a couple things. One, I have a question for Roger. You brought up about the Garden of Eden and there was a duality and something to be in sync, or that was synchronized, that once you had consciousness, it then became uncomfortable. So I'd like if you could kind of go through that again. And then the other thing that came out is it's something that goes back to we had a prior conversation, time. Our awareness of time, maybe that's our consciousness. The fact that we are not only in the moment, but we have an awareness of the past and an awareness of the future, what could be the potential of the future. And that can provide a tremendous advantage over beings, or whatever you want to call it, that you have over them, in the sense that you're not only in the moment, and you can do things to affect the future. So just I could just keep going on, because there was just many things that just kind of popped out, that I kind of wrote things down that I need to think about again. But tremendous, wonderful. I totally enjoyed tonight. It was tremendous.
Thank you, David. Wait a minute, there are 4 Davids in line, 4 Davids in a row. Okay, it's going to be Dave from Tacoma, David Miller, then David Adelson, then everybody else. Dave.
Just happens to be the most popular name in 1947, I'll have you know.
Okay.
But anyway, Roger, fantastic presentation. The point I want to make, because the point you made at the end, that we are a twin with God, as the first time I'd really heard that expressed that way, and it was an interesting concept. Because what I would like to point out is that we're constantly rejected by God. The Cain and Abel story, Jordan likes to get into quite often, but getting kicked out of the garden, and then the flood, although Noah got a ride for a while, but as opposed for 40 days and nights of rain, I'd just say God flushed the earth. But to me, the thing is, and the other is the Tower of Babel that we talked about in a different meetup. But it's one time after another, it's almost that we're not the equal of God, but we're a playmate, it sounds like. Anyway, my 2 bits worth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. David number 3, David Miller.
Yes, just to continue with what Dave was just saying, in the Zoroastrian religion of the ancient Persian Empire, they're the Parsis today. God, their God, creates humans in order to be allies in the destruction of evil. That was the purpose of the creation of humans, in fact, of the world itself, because for them, the God, there was an equally powerful God of evil, and the Creator God needed us, those of us who were willing, of course, to help him destroy evil. But the point I wanted to make was simply that there's a problem, if you take the text of the Bible seriously and look at what the biblical scholars have analyzed, and see, chapter 1 is written hundreds of years later than chapter 2, than the Adam and Eve story. And in chapter 1, of course, this is where it says we were made in the image of God. But as we've been discussing, that's obviously in contradiction with the Adam and Eve story. We were not made in the image of God because we were commanded not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Go and look up the Bible text itself. Just read it for yourselves. Therefore, we were commanded, humans were commanded not to have a moral dimension. So how can, without morality, humans be made in the image of God? I mean, why did they claim that it was the priests who wrote that chapter 1 hundreds of years later? Well, why did they contradict what was in Adam and Eve? In Adam and Eve, we're not in the image of God. We don't have a moral dimension. And when we gain one, we gain that knowledge of good and evil, God gets angry and says they've become like us, knowing good and evil. So it's not a fall, it's an elevation to godhood that he didn't want. So he kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. But go and read the story for yourself. Try and escape what you've been brainwashed into by the priesthood. Read it for yourselves and see what the words on the page. Look, Jordan Peterson is accepting the traditional interpretation that the priests give you. Read it for yourself and see what it really says. It was an elevation to godhood, and he gets angry because that's not what he wanted. He didn't want us to have a moral dimension.
Wonderful.
That's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David number 3. Now there's going to be David number 4, and there is David number 5. So I'm going to go to David number 5 after David number 4. So David number 4 is David Adelson. David, go ahead.
Hello. Well, thanks again, Roger, and Victor and Claire for an amazing presentation as always. And I'll continue where I left off as another incarnation of David. Should we look at this relationship between humans and God not as a linear, not as a line, not as extremes, but as a circle? I mean, is that another way of interpreting how there is this duality between humans and God, that at such an extreme of powerlessness, or we say that we become all powerful?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is David S., the final David 5.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, well, okay. Oh, see, we're being called on without even raising our hands. Okay, well, I'll say
That's
something.
just because you're a David. David, just go first. That's the rule now.
Okay, well, I feel so embarrassed that I'm not wearing any clothes. No, I'm sorry. No, I just have I had the camera off for no reason. I don't mean to be ashamed. So yeah, I sort of disagree with a lot of things that were just said, which is interesting, because I think the fact that we can deny commands or follow commands is what happens in Genesis. Like, we just defied an absolute command. Of course, we didn't see any reason in the command. So we're letting reason start to become our power. And this ability to deny or follow what the universe is saying to do is our degree of control, our creative activity in the universe. We become creators of what will be. So I think it's a really cool story that makes us like an image of what God can do. And I would say that the literal, original wasn't image. It was more like shadow. We're made as like a projection, a shadow of, but we're related to that creative process. So I kind of like that in the story here.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Okay, so now with all David's done. It's going to be everybody else. It's going to be Joe, Mike, and the Great Heart. Joe.
Yeah, so basically, most of what I was going to say has already been covered. So in the past few, specifically with Dave from Tacoma, you know, covering one of my takeaways. But the thing that I'm really struggling to get my head around is the idea of limitations and how that gives structures to consciousness. And I understand that that's, something that we're going to be probably covering in the next couple of weeks. But I really wasn't really necessarily how our limitations, essentially give rise to a new structure and a new form. And that just isn't something that I really, it's cleared it up a little bit for me, but I'm still a little bit unclear about that. But as far as the other things, the idea of God being in the image and likeness of man, and how myth is used to understand as, our part in a whole, that we need to explain this whole, it is to understand what our role is in the world, was another takeaway as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Great Heart. Folks, go ahead and type ! Or raise your hand in Zoom in order to share your takeaways. Mike, I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm not sure what to believe, but I've read some of this story of Genesis written by some real authorities, including St. Augustine, City of God. When God is talking to his disciples, when in particular to Moses, when he was giving this history book 1,000 years after this occurred, and explaining all this stuff, and he couldn't explain creation in the current belief to his disciples. He was talking to somebody who didn't understand microbiology, did not understand quantum electrodynamics, and didn't understand Peterson's 12 rules for living. So he's talking in fables. You shouldn't interpret any of these stories too literally. So he could have said, explained in detail how wave functions collapse, and the properties of empty space, and whether, and maybe the properties of light. But it was easier if you were going to explain this to your 10-year-old niece, you would probably pick up a story something like this and talk in terms of parables. Now, there's many, these things were originally given not in I believe, in ancient Hebrew, which was probably a lot like ancient English, which when you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales doesn't quite make sense to us today. And then it was translated into Latin and Greek, and then finally into English. When these authorities say, when the original text, and when the original text says not that you shouldn't eat the fruit of that one tree, it said this is what's going to happen when you eat the fruit from this one tree. And if you have a bunch of Oreo cookies on a plate and say, you're not, save these for later, don't touch them, and then you go away, those Oreo cookies are going to get eaten. So that's how they got expelled from the Garden of Eden. And that's how Cain and Abel got into their nose, and that's why the flood came. None of this should be taken too literally, but it's a moral fable on how people should live. And I didn't expect you to call me this quickly because I can't fill my 2 minutes right now, but
You have already
yield
done
the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Next up is Great Heart, followed by Gene.
Oh, can I add one more thing though?
Sure.
One of the authorities that wrote a book on this subject is the guy who is Fauci's, the guy, the vaccine guy's boss, and he could be elevated to his huge position by mapping the human DNA and understanding the relationship between DNA and mRNA, which made all this possible.
Okay.
And he was raised in a commune as an atheist. In writing in working on the DNA stuff and getting his MD, PhD, he decided there must have been a God. So he became an evangelist. He is the one who came up with this, that this is a fable. And his book is called, which is, I think is not in print. It's called The Language of God. And it displays that, and it talks about quantum electrodynamics and DNA, RNA, creating proteins and reverse
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. Next up is Gene, followed by, let me see, Gene, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So we had a great discussion with First David, and I think I found we talk about time. I found it's quite intriguing because I found in the past people seem to have bigger range of sense of time. Like think about Chinese history. The emperor built their tomb for generations. That's what we can see today. And even when I watched the musical Hamilton, Hamilton could leave if he doesn't fight for his reputation in the future, which he will not see anyway. So it seems people in the past and the founding father, they're thinking so much for the future. That's what they're based on. But today, people don't even think about their retirement. So it seems we are talking more about living in the moment, which I don't object, but it seems we are living in much shorter range of time now. So I wonder what's the reason. So maybe the macro and micro, we should have a bigger vision of time, how we place in history, and also maybe smaller the moment. We need to increase both. Otherwise, I think today's people life is so, so detailed. They don't really see that vision anymore. That's my impression.
Thank you, Jean. Next up is Great Heart, followed by Marisa. Great Heart. Are you there? Okay, I don't see him here. Okay, next up is Marisa.
Hi, I think Roger and Victor and Claire did a really great job with really dense subject material here. I feel like there's so many smaller subsets of the data that we can pull out and still extrapolate. I'm fascinated by the concept of the objectivity versus the subjectivity, and by the idea of the fact that in the Garden of Eden, there was not the consciousness prior to having been, I guess, enticed, as it were, by chaos. And as such, it's interesting because what I see throughout the chapter is that what is pointed to as order seems to change just slightly. At different points, the order is Eden, and sometimes order is God. And then, but we've already identified the female form as chaos. And so it's interesting that she's identified in future going forward, way after the Genesis, she's identified as the being of the unknown of the chaos, but she is initially, she doesn't have consciousness. So consciousness in her creates the chaos, is what I'm seeing. But it doesn't, it's interesting that, so Roger did point out that, and this was in our breakout room, he pointed out that, you know, when God walks up to Adam and Eve right after they're now aware, they're hiding behind a tree. And God's like, what are you guys doing? Why are you behind that tree? I'm God, you know, I see you, right? And they're all like, you know, we're scared of you and we were naked, so we hid. And it points to a level of immaturity that reminds me of when one first realizes that one is in a situation where one just cannot find objectivity. So when we are stuck in subjective mode, we tend to be more childlike, more immature just by default, because we are reactionary, we're more emotional. And as we take a pause and we work towards moving forward with more objectivity, well, then we grow and we expand. And it's, so that's kind of the spin I'm taking from that story there, is that I think that that's kind of what is being pointed out to us. So it's not necessarily, you know, I don't want to sit there and think too hard about this omniscient being and, you know, whether or not he's puppeteering me, but the fact of the question that, you know, now we're human beings, right? So we have this, like, I think Peterson says it's a head full of alternative opinions, and we do, but, you know, there's also the not so pleasant saying that people do say about opinions, right? So if we exercise wisdom with all of these opinions that are now floating about in our head or that we can see, well, then we can move towards more objectivity. But the interesting thing is that Peterson tells us that the way to get to wisdom is through these stories and meta stories that he's identified. And to me, that's how this chapter does a great job of kind of tying in a bunch of other concepts that he's presented to us in the book. And I will admit, I'm actually not reading the book in order. I'm reading it kind of all chopped up, but I am watching all the videos in addition to reading it. But it doesn't seem to be taken away at all from my enjoyment of the experience and of being able to put different concepts together. And I don't know if I just rambled and it made no sense. If it didn't, I apologize, but that's my takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. Next up is going to be Greatheart, Ron, and Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to underline what I saw as a thread in some of the setup here throughout the discussion. And that is starting at the very beginning, we with the paradigm Jordan Peterson used, there's a place where we are and a place where we want to be, or a place where we want to go. There was also discussion in here about possibilities and prospects. So we're aware of our future. And I just wanted to mention there's another, I agree with that. I think that's really very important. And it's in agreement with a book written by Martin Seligman, who's used to be the president of the American Psychological Association and one of the founders of positive psychology. He wrote a book called Homo Prospectus and said that it's really our foresight or attempts at foresight as opposed to our knowledge, which characterizes us best. But the other thing I wanted to touch on, more my own confection, is that there's been a lot of talk in the general paradigm that has been laid out by Jordan Peterson. We have the Great Mother, the Great Father, and then the Son, who is portrayed as a hero in most of these instances. Where he discovers the good that's in the past culture and also the possibilities that are available in chaos, the good possibilities. He brings them together and creates a new future. I think to do that, it has to, the new future he brings forward needs to be accepted by other people. There has to be some buy-in. So I just add that as a footnote. But I would point out that not all of these individuals who have pulled together the good out of chaos and the good out of culture are heroes. They don't return with the boon for the benefit of all humanity. Some of them return with a benefit and it's not recognized by others. And though these people might be prophets or saints that maybe eventually are recognized. But then there are also others that recognize a boon that's available, but they don't bring it back for the benefit of mankind, they bring it back for their own benefit. And they abuse and exploit it. They abuse other people and they exploit this benefit. These are villains. And a lot of these villains pass themselves off as heroes. So that's something to look out for. But I just wanted to elaborate a bit on what I see as some variations in this model.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Great Heart. Let's see. Next up is going to be Ron, followed by Paul. Ron.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Now I'm almost forgetting my question. One was, if there is time, I'd kind of be curious, Roger, if you went back to that part you skipped, if there's like a quickie, I guess it was on the expulsion. And I'm wondering if there's any relationship with the expulsion and the idea of being thrown into time, in that point, or if that happened, earlier. And just does Peterson, does he use the lingo of kind of timelessness and time as a way to speak to the different domains that some traditions would, look at the absolute and the relative in a sense? Because the stuff you talked about with time and some others have alluded to here about how our forebears had to be so struck when they discovered time that it was a huge thing to them, and maybe we're taking it for granted in a way. And I also just wanted to say, since I'm a believer in synchronicity, I think we should all maybe read up a little bit on King David later tonight, because I feel like that archetype came up for a reason, and maybe that David versus Saul might be an interesting theme to read about going to bed tonight.
Yes, Davids were in majority today. Next up is Paul.
Yes, I heard there was a secret chord that David played to please the Lord, but we won't go further than that on that one. But on this night, thank you, everyone. I came away with some sort of synthesis of my own thoughts on these subjects. This was hugely helpful. And I want to say it and ask a question related to it as briefly as I can, which is my sense when I put all this together as to where I come down on Genesis right now in my brain is I love the relationship of what he talked about to the individual. So there's this eating of the tree of knowledge that can plunge us into chaos from which we grow. And that happens at an individual level. So Srikant is pushing us all to learn, which could push us into chaos. But that's sort of, and it's beautiful. And I want to tie it to what one of the Davids said, which is the book of, some of these books have implications that that's a bad thing. But one could argue, and my question is, does Jordan Peterson ever argue that those are not the beautiful maps of consciousness from the wisdom of the ages, but power structures, because chaos is dangerous to them, inserting into the religious texts, don't be bad. So that's kind of my question, because at an individual level, we want to seek the knowledge, even if it brings chaos. So those are my thoughts.
Wonderful, Paul. So before I give a chance for Roger and Victor to respond to these, I want to tell you about 2 meetups coming up. I'm going to tell about one meetup, and then Roger is going to tell about one meetup series. So The meetup that I would highly recommend is the best approach I have seen to chaos, of actually dealing with chaos. And this is done in the context of military. In the context of war, in the midst of battle, everything is changing. So chaos is actually, you are in chaos. How do you deal with it effectively? There is a gentleman called John Boyd who developed an idea called OODA loop, which completely transformed the way in which the military functions. That is the difference between the Vietnam War and the first Gulf War. So first Gulf War, Schwarzkopf called John Boyd in, and something like 90% of the Marines started operating using his ideas. About 75% of the Special Operations Force did that, maybe 1/3 of the Army. Army did not really take to it quickly enough, but Marines are in maximum chaos, or special ops are in maximum chaos. So that is the idea. Now, we are fortunate to have the closest associate of John Boyd, Chet Richards, coming and talking about John Boyd and OODA loop this Saturday at 12 p.m. So we're going to be talking about OODA loop. Not only we will be talking about the history of it in the military context, and then talking about how do you apply it to business and how do you apply it to life. So that's the best idea that I have on dealing with chaos. I've been reading about it for 10 years, 20 years, but I still find every time I go back to it, I get a lot from it. So that's what I would recommend. Next up is Roger. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the only issue right now is that currently that's almost around the same time. So I'm currently about to open on another discussion group. Essentially, we're going to be going through Jordan Peterson's biblical series. And the way this will work is that the first hour will start at 12, but the first hour up until 1:15, we'll be streaming the lecture and kind of watching it together. And anyone who would like to comment, we can comment. We'll keep the comments open and people can kind of talk and discuss of their thoughts as we're watching it. And then from 1:15 to 3 p.m., we'll be opening it for discussion. So if you would like to attend the OODA loop, you can definitely skip the streaming hour and just watch it some other time and then drop in for discussion. It tends to be much smaller groups, so a lot more people tend to be talking. It's not me talking so much. It's more just kind of anyone and everyone who's coming, sharing their own ideas and bouncing off of each other in a much more informal way.
Wonderful. All right. So Roger, let's talk about the general themes that you would like to talk about. I've made some notes here. I'm sure Victor has made some notes. We can talk about general themes. Wait, let me just ladder off the themes that I have that came up. One is what is the relationship between man and God? What's the exact relationship between man and God? What do you think? What are the various? So that's one. The second big question that kept coming up is the question of time. What is time? Those are the two big topics that everybody seemed to be focused on, that I noticed.
Yeah, so the idea of man and God, or I guess that the main relationship is the logos. That is the capacity to be able to take what is chaos and transform it into all you have to think about is what makes a god, and the ability to transform reality into whatever it is that they desire, or at least the ability to manipulate reality into what they want, is one of the bigger attributes of almost, is at least a power that often is associated with God. And it's also one that we have to a great extent, right? And by comparison to just about any other form of life that's on Earth, we are by far the ones that seem to have the most control out of that aspect. So for me, the idea of in the image of God, and Peterson points this out, it's you could easily interpret it as just oh, we look like him, or we are like him, or we're at the same level as him. But Peterson kind of more puts it up as I think it's much more sophisticated than that. I think it's more a matter of the same thing that is able to create everything. In almost all myths, the gods are the ones that create the world. The same things are able to do that. There's something within us that is at least a reflection, if not the same thing, that allows us to be in that exact same act, right? Of that creative action, that something that I can imagine, I can therefore create or make, that I can formulate a fantasy and then make that fantasy come to actual reality.
Wonderful. So folks, if you have thoughts about this particular topic of relationship between man and God, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. Victor, what about you? What themes do you see coming out from all the takeaways?
Yeah, it's the same thing. The idea, the relationship between God and human. Sometimes sometimes it tends to feel like it's not a great relationship. Meaning it feels like God is giving everything, but at the same time, he's punishing a lot. So it's one way of saying it. So that's one theme. And the second theme, as you mentioned, it's the relationship with time, a human's understanding of time. And also the idea of, so one person, I totally forgot the name, but mentioned about consciousness. And it could be consciousness that is giving us a perspective on time, to see future, past, and the present at the same time. So these three themes. And Joe asked a very good question about the new structure or the new form. So to understand that a consciousness seeing something and to form a structure out of the whole matrix, how to understand that particular point. So that's a very good question.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I kind of had a couple, I wrote down the questions that people were asking, so I just wanted to kind of run through them real quick. Yes. For David R, the question was, how do we essentially become unsynced with God? Or what is that idea that like we used to walk with God and once consciousness happens, we don't? And it's essentially the difference between self-consciousness and not. And so you can make the argument that animals are conscious, but they're not self-conscious. They're not, most of them tend to not be aware enough to be able to know that essentially have an existential crisis, right? Like you don't see you don't see animals just get depressed for no reason because they've realized that their mortality is coming. And, and to some extent you can make an argument against that. But essentially the main case here is that at some point we became so self-aware that we stopped being similar to animals in that sense, that there's a distinction, there's something that makes us different from animals. But at the same time, at some point we were animals. We were exactly the same. We were at the same level. But somewhere in our past, there was either a gradual or in the mythic sense, a very quick split. But the fact that that came about made it so that we woke up and became aware of our surroundings in a way that nothing now seems to be able to have done, right? Like that. And if you think of God as the totality of things, as everything else, you can see how we become unsynced with that. Because whereas with animals, they are just kind of reacting and adapting to the current environment, as humans, we can perceive time, we can see way into the future, we can imagine our death and then time past our death, right? And that all changes how we view and react to things in such a way that we're no longer just willing to go with whatever flow happens. Real quick on David Tacoma.
Let's do one thing. Pegor has some things about relationship between man and God. Pegor, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mentioned this in the chat. The way that I see it is the relationship that we have, or specifically when it says like, and we were created in the image of God, it's logos, that's the common thing. So in the Genesis story, God says, let there be light, and then there's light, and then it says, and he saw that it was good. And Peterson talks about this in his biblical series. We have, to a lesser magnitude, the same capability. Since we live in a social world, we can, with our speech, create reality. So I can just right now call my mom or something and lie to her and completely transform her reality in a bad way, or I can tell her something truthful and create a new reality to her, for her, that's good. And so that's the thing that I think that we have in common with God. Obviously, we cannot create planets and the material world, but we can most definitely transform the social world. And as Peterson, I think in today's video, says that the social and the natural are so similar that we can't even distinguish between them. It's like the social is so baked into us that it's almost natural. And so that's all. That's what I have to say regarding our sort of what it means, at least in my opinion, that we are created in the image of God, is that we can also wield logos, truthful speech, to create, or wield untruthful speech to destroy or create bad things.
I want to add one thing, following up on what you said, Roger, about this kind of self-consciousness. I think self-consciousness is the heart of the transformation. Yesterday we had, no, 2 days ago on Tuesday, we had a presentation on Julian Jaynes. And he has this wonderful idea of, like, if you look at animals or primitive people, they are reactive. So just as you were saying, you know, stuff happens and then you immediately react. What human beings developed is this mental space in the middle where you could take in stuff and then you could see, oh, I could possibly do this. This would happen in the future, and then direct your action based on it. So it's kind of creating a mental space with which you can manipulate things, where you can project things, you can consider alternatives, consequences of it, and then act. That is essentially self-consciousness of saying, this is what it's, so I think that is the heart of the transition that I see.
Yeah, I think that fits pretty well, because I think there's several things that kind of all interconnect with this. It's self-awareness of vulnerability, awareness of time, and also a capacity for simulation, which is kind of what you're referring to, right? So the capacity to simulate the world outside of you, the capacity to see through time to be able to predict future things, and the capacity to be self-aware of the vulnerability. But you can also see how all of these kind of could have arisen quite similarly. It may very well have been that physiologically we're able to first simulate the world, and then we start simulating. It's like, well, what's going to happen tomorrow? It's like, well, wait, what happens after that, and after that, and after that, and eventually it's like, well, at some point this has to end, and that kind of kicks off all the other realizations all at once.
Wonderful. Great Heart, you had a point about this. Please go on.
Following up on what Shrikant and Roger just said, I would agree with that. I really think that's an essential point. And this space that's in the mind is where freedom exists. And we exercise our freedom in this way, in the moment. Some things we can stop and think about, the bigger things. The other things we can't, but it happens more in the flow. But that's where freedom is. If you're not pausing, reflecting in some way, then you're reactive, you're not acting in a free way. And this freedom comes from this space.
Excellent point. Roger, next one.
Oh, yeah, right. So David Tacoma had a point of, we're not equal to gods, we're more like playthings. And yeah, I think that's more than fair. I think the point isn't that we're equal so much that we're God-like. So we have something similar to God, but by no means, are we on the same level, which kind of goes also to David Miller's point that it seems as though God just didn't want us to get those powers. He seemed to actually be kind of holding us down and oppressing us, and that it wasn't a benefit. And though I can definitely see that point, I think the only thing I would add is that we only became godlike enough to see that we didn't become godlike enough, right? Like we just became aware enough to know that we die, and that before we die, there's going to be a lot of scary things that could happen. Hence why in the myth, this is one of the parts for Ron, one of the parts that I didn't go into because we ran out of time, was that's why the punishment for being banned from Eden is that the man will toil for the rest of his life and then die. And from dust you were born, to dust you'll return, right? Like super harsh, like you're going to work your ass off all your life and then you'll die. Well, why? Well, because the minute you become self-aware of your vulnerability and aware of everything else, it's not as though God's punishing you. It's just by learning that mechanic, you can already see what's coming and there's nothing you can do about it. And you're going to be scared the entire time. And because you're constantly scared of what the future might bring, and you can see it coming, you're going to work to prepare against it. You're going to work your entire life to try and prevent whatever scary things you think might happen. And then even though you're working to try and save and keep your life alive, you will still die. And you know that from the day one, from today, you already know that. And you know that that's the case. And that's your punishment for becoming like a god. Is that cool? You get to see all of this play out your entire life from the start. And you know that that's how it's going to end, right? Like you can see it all come in. And the worst part is it's not even defined. It's not even like you know exactly when it ends. You just know that it will end. And you're constantly trying to manage that path. So I guess I don't see the punishment that God gives as so much as a punishment, as just kind of a description of what happens when we became self-aware, when we became aware of our situation.
Excellent. David R., go ahead.
So I just wanted to pick up on something that you just mentioned between the self-awareness. When that occurred, I would assume that there had to have been some sort of a biological transition or change that occurred. Was that evolutionary motivated? And if so, what would be the stimulus to create that change from whatever you want to call the being that was not self-aware? What would have been the external stimulus to create the genetic changes that would create or cause the biological switch to turn on and form self-awareness? Or was there something else that happened that occurred and created the biological change, genetic change?
Right.
It flipped that switch and gave us the self-awareness.
Well, trying to keep it more.
Today we are talking about the concept of time. Sorry. This is from the.
Yeah, so more keeping it grounded. It goes back to that last slide of that or the second to last slide, that idea that women likely became conscious first. And it's like, why? It's like, well, because one, to be self-conscious means to be aware of your vulnerability. Well, who would that serve? Well, it would serve the person that's most vulnerable and needs that information, needs to be aware of when they are vulnerable. And like we pointed out, a woman is already vulnerable, smaller to men by comparison, but then also on top of that is burdened with an even more vulnerable child. So that's the idea, like for Peterson, that's one of the ideas of that representation, that the woman is the one that entices the man and the woman is the one that tries the fruit first. It's psychologically an adaptive tool, right? When you know you're in danger and you know you're like, yeah, there's not a good situation here, you need to be aware of that. And that's evolutionarily advantageous. But then on the flip side, once you're aware of all that, it also allows you to be more picky as to what man you're gonna approach and get close to and all that, which then forces the men to also creates a second evolutionary pressure for them to become self-aware too, and to be aware of their own vulnerabilities, of their own weaknesses, of their own undesirable aspects. And that's why Peterson also believed that there was the sexual aspect of both the man and the woman seeing each other and being shocked that they can see each other naked, and both of them wanting to hide their parts from themselves, from the other person. As like, that's kind of being the evolutionary pressure that pushes us both to be conscious, but then also be selective. And kind of Peterson, going on other lectures, I won't get too into it, but Peterson also believes essentially that once the hierarchy is formed, and especially once women became more selective of their mates, the next question became, what was it that they're selecting? What was it that was being selected for? And that can lead to a lot of ways. It can lead to possible intelligence, or even just consciousness, greater or greater awareness, or just kindness, right? Like if you select someone who's more kind to you, there's also an indication that they're more self-aware of the surroundings. That's one of the things that we call and that we actually talk about, and that a lot of times is found attractive by women. If you are considerate of their emotions, if you do understand and are empathetic to other people. So there's a lot of evolutionary claims that or like arguments that you could make as to where that could come from.
So I have a few things to say. I mean, the best thing I have ever seen on this development of self-consciousness is by Julian Jaynes. So this Tuesday, we had the head of Julian Jaynes Society talking exactly about this topic. The point I made about the space over here, Julian Jaynes holds that this is a function of language, and he has a very detailed theory of exactly how it happened, when it happened. So it was basically the language was serving as a part of a larger empire. So to kind of give a connection to evolution, what happens is that in a primate troop, everybody else follows the alpha male. And that's how they operate. They just basically listen to alpha, but alpha male is always around because you're all in sight of each other all the time. What happens is that when you move to a larger civilization, that becomes like the god king, and the voice of the god king directs you. When these empires fall apart and you no longer hear the god king because whatever the god king said doesn't work anymore, you kind of have to use the same tools that you used, that of language, to start directing, to create your space in here in order to consider the possibilities yourself. And that is the beginning of self-consciousness, according to Julian Jaynes. This is a very brief overview of it. So I've put a link to the meetup that we did. We are going to do a follow-up meetup on how language develops through metaphors, especially the concepts dealing with consciousness, how they come from kind of bodily concepts of like blood rising to that being like thumos, being converted into courage. So we've got an anthropologist who has spent, decades studying that. He's going to be here on 24th, and I'll be interviewing him on development of language and self-consciousness that time.
And can I just add one other thing real quick? That also goes, just trying to like put in the things I skipped as they fit. But as for the punishment of women, that's also where it fits because of our, that cortical expanse, that once this huge growth in our brains, the punishment, for Peterson, the idea is like at the same time that we have that huge growth from our brains, that's when we start to become aware of time, because that tends to be, if I understand it right, that tends to be more where memories and planning and all that seem to form. But as a consequence of eating the fruit, the punishment for women is that they'll have painful birth. And if you see a woman's anatomy, their hips are as wide as they can. And if they were any wider, they wouldn't actually be able to run. And also our babies are born still fetal, if they were maintained until they grew to like it's similar to a giraffe that just can drop and run, it'd be 2 years. So you can imagine a 2-year-old coming out. Well, you can try, except for the one idea of like, how would that even happen physically? And so the cost of that is that we essentially pushed our body frames to the maximum capacity, and and human birth is, extremely painful, very dangerous, and a lot of times it's a risk. And mythologically, it's represented as the price that God put on us for our attainment of our ability as to be godlike.
Yeah, and the flip side, the advantage of that is that we get born with our brain only half formed. So rest of the brain develops in interacting with the world, with each other. So it gives us tremendous plasticity of behavior and of learning. So fantastic. But evolution, if you are not into evolution, please read on evolution. It's such a profound inspiration. And I think that's the best context to understand life. And then you can kind of build everything on the top of that. So, all right. Next up, Judith.
Yep. So just wondering though, I just can't let go of this whole animal thing. So Jane Goodall did studies, chimps will mourn for their loss. They'll starve themselves to death, or some apes, some kind of primate. When a loved one in their group dies, that it's been documented that they can take it that hard. So there are just examples where, wouldn't that be sort of like, how can you have that kind of empathy without a little bit of introspection or a space, and I don't know, when you describe animals, it's just seems to blanket, people who have pets have seen them do very interesting planned out activities that require intelligence to figure out for their own gain or purpose. So I feel it's on a spectrum, and we just put this line. And I know language is important, but then when you bring up language, then I can't help but think of how we are just excluding cultures that communicate profound ideas. Like, think of the wisdom of your illiterate grandmother or grandfather. Suppose you grew up, they didn't get educated, and yet they have all this knowledge, and it's not language and logic based like in higher education. Well, where does that fit in? Like, is this, if you're putting everything on a scale like this, it almost seems like there's a hierarchy involved, and it kind of bothers me. I don't know. It's something I think a lot about. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you have responses on that.
No, yeah, and several things to consider, right? First and foremost, that in this mythological perspective, it is ancient people attempting to understand how and why they got here, right? It's not a scientific claim or it's barely even a factual claim. That's why at the start, we're looking at this much more as an artistic attempt to try and explain what it is that human existence even is. And I think their point, though, your point is 100% fair, right? Like, animals seem to have some form of at least proto emotion. The hard part there is we don't actually know what's going on there, because none of us can go into that form of consciousness, if that's what we want to call it. But at the same time, there obviously seems to be something more there than we've ever known before. I think the point more is there's still a massive difference, right? Even our closest relatives within our own, general evolutionary tree don't even compete. They're not even close. And probably the closest to what we did have were the Neanderthals, which we very quickly killed. So it's not so much an idea that there isn't value there, or even that they don't have consciousness or they don't have things. It's just the distinction between us and them is so massive that you can have them as pets, that you can create an entire city, that we can go to other pieces of space, and that we can do pretty much whatever we'd like to these animals. And these animals don't have much of a capacity to stand up or do anything back. And that's more what it means by the dominion of the animals, is that they're just outclassed, and they're outclassed by something. And that's more the point. It's like, so they naturally probably do have a lot of the things that reflect similar to us, but there's also obviously a massive difference in that, which is what makes us be able to currently be talking from people all around the States or even all around the world. Whereas I could put several monkeys here, and I don't know if any of them would even be able to turn on the computer, right? Like, that distinction of that is more the highlight.
But Roger, if I just may add, so as animals aside, okay, if your basis is on the idea of mastery of language, right? People with a higher education can make all kinds of logical arguments that are good, and we do all kinds of science with all that, math and all of that. Is that our litmus test for like what is who understands our world the best? What?
No.
what things do we need to bring in besides? Is it going to be, I don't think we can just have language as a litmus test for that, but I feel like that's where this is going.
So language as a litmus test for what, I guess, is what I'm getting lost in.
For our understanding, our ability to introspect and understand our world. And
well, I do think language plays a massive part. I don't think it's the only one. I think, like we were talking about, the capacity to be able to select specific potentials and actuate them into reality is much more both what the story highlights and what I personally see as the main big difference, right? Like the capacity to be able to imagine a fantasy and then create it. And that's kind of the main big difference between us and other other forms of life. Because I think even like the language and education aspect, for example, we're currently talking about Genesis, which is one of the older stories of, you know, us as people. So like, I don't think necessarily that education or anything like that plays in so much as just the, yeah, I guess for me, it's much more that ability to be able to see the future, predict alternative futures, and do actions that allow futures that we've imagined to come to be.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that because language is not about education. It's about what you can, you know, time is a very good matrix, you know, can you see time? So people who are not educated, sometimes they are actually better, much better at projecting time, seeing what is possible, being able to figure out what is going on with people, what should be done in situations. There are people who go into business, right, you know, without going to school, and they have a much greater ability of dealing with the world using language. So language is not at all equated with education or higher education. So next up is David for Edelson, and then Kevin. David.
Yeah, thanks very much. I wanted to follow up about Roger's discussion of the relationship and soul between God and human beings. And I know that the focus is on Genesis, but looking at least from Judaism and some of the later books, in maybe as an interpretation of what that original relationship was, some of the specific statements attributed to God are in Exodus that you shall make no other God before me. You shall not worship anyone else. But about what God does want, the main statement from, for example, Deuteronomy is you shall love the Lord your God. So the statement, at least in the Jewish tradition, in the Torah, is about love. And that's the purpose. And also, I mean, one interpretation related to what Roger was discussing about needing to have that, I mean, again, in Genesis, of God withdrawing, of God creating a boundary, because one can't even define what this expanse infinite is without something to create that definition. That one interpretation in Judaism is that God was love and that God needed, but love needs the definition of a partner. What is love without having someone else to represent that love, to respond to that, to reflect that love? And so the sense of God saying, okay, I need to go through this challenge, go through this exertion of withdrawing myself and creating this partner, because the only way that I can understand love, that I, God, can be love, is to have a partner that I can love and that can love me. And so I needed to create human beings as this partner to be able to create this duality of love, which couldn't exist without this partnership.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I actually really, really like that. I mean, personally, because of my personal beliefs, but yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I guess I don't really have anything else to say to that one. That one's pretty good.
Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Pegor. Kevin.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Well, I got two comments. One is about language. Language, one word, but it's communication. It's better from generation by generation. We communicate better. Also, language itself, look historically, some language, some words gone. That's our history. Like you can read our history. If some words, new words generated, that's our future could be. One thing I would see is the old language, Asian language, Egyptian, right? The old, until one French gentleman can read that. About 700 years ago, Chinese character, they find out it's back 100 years ago. They only find, oh, what's that? It's like break something. People, it's bone. It's a cell bone and or a cow bone. They write character. Actually, that's a language. That time, if you see that language, you can learn some years ago how they work, how they living better. That's another story. My question and takeaway about the responsibility, Roger, you mentioned lack of responsibility, and here for me, for our own individual society, obviously we lack responsibility for ourselves, for society, for the earth. Whereas the animal, let's see, rights and their ownership about the earth. We talk about only our human being as individuals, but Western culture, we individualize, right? Let's see, hierarchic. We talk about a lot, let's see, can you imagine Amazon, Walmart? Then how about a convenience store? How about a personal? We get it slowly, we lost our own as individual rights. And like Amazon, what's the tax? How much they pay tax? The middle class get shrink, like a tax structure shrink too. So that's need to think about it too. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Pegor.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you to you, Roger, Claire, and Victor for the presentation. I wanted to add to the answer regarding language and what sort of makes us different from animals is that, first of all, on the, I guess you could say the biological or evolutionary perspective, there's a specific difference between humans and chimpanzees, which is that if, let's say you have a human adult, let's say a mother and a child, and the adult points at a specific object, the child will also look at the thing that's being pointed, whereas chimpanzees can't do that. And so the only way in there's some sort of knowledge transfer between chimpanzees is via imitation, direct imitation. So one chimpanzee sees the other chimpanzee using a stick to go into the anthill and pull out the insects. That's how they do it. So that's one sort of biological difference, I guess, that we have that other animals don't. And the second, with regards to languages, it's an oral library, effectively. And this is something we've sort of forgotten about, but oral traditions used to be very powerful. Like people used to remember like stories that are thousands of words long, and they could recite it on the spot. And so people basically had books in their mind, in their memories. And so that ability to transfer knowledge from one generation to the other acts as an exponential, basically an exponential growth. And so that's why we're so different and so advanced from them, from animals.
Excellent. I just want to, I really like the point. I want to say a couple of things about it. Firstly, I mean, I really like your observation that a chimpanzee can just imitate actions. So it's like action to action transmission through perception, immediate. Whereas what language is doing is that it's like a simulation, right? I mean, when you're telling a story, right, you're saying this can happen to anybody, and I'm using the words to create this simulation. I'm actually not doing it, but I'm creating the simulation. Other people can get it, and so it's kind of one level removed. You're trying to kind of simulate everything in your head using this tool of language, and then you can even transmit it to this other head without actually going through the actual actions that you're talking about. So it's like a simulation device. Roger?
No, yeah, I definitely agree. And I also really like Pegor's point about language, because essentially language is just one language. You can look at it as language as a tool. So like our language is constantly changing, shaping, and growing in our form of communication. But then the second thing is, what is that language being used for? And like Pegor noted, it's like these stories kind of just keep getting repeated, and that itself becomes a quasi or semi-evolutionary function where all the parts that aren't relevant or that are boring or that aren't interesting start to get cut off or forgotten or ignored. But then all the key points keep getting reinforced. So then you get like a refinement process where the stories get more and more and more refined until you get to just what's interesting and just what's, from Jung and Peterson's perspective, what's archetypical, right? Like what's the real solution to the real problem, and how does it break down in as short and concise a way as you can get it? And that happens through a constant process of repetition, and a lot of people messing up the story to the point where you get it down to just, the pure uncut archetype.
Excellent. Next up is Joe.
This might be a little too off topic, and if it is, just say it. But the idea stems from the idea of Tuesday night, with Julian James's explanation of consciousness, and the idea of being as well kind of fits into this framework. But one of the things that he specified that wasn't needed for consciousness is this idea of reasoning. So it sounds like we're kind of like talking about reasoning as one of these distinguishing characteristics between us and animals. But it was kind of, it's not jiving with what that means to be conscious or come into being.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that, that's the point that Marcel made. I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know whether, that's the, I don't read James that way, because what according to James, when he says consciousness, he means self-consciousness. That's what he means. He's saying self-consciousness is what really distinguishes human beings. Like chimpanzees are conscious in the sense that they're aware that there is a banana there, or there is another, snake there. They are aware of that. So in that sense, they are conscious. What they are not is that they are not self-conscious, in the sense that they are not observing. They're not able to have this space inside their head where they can say, oh, I am actually watching snake, therefore I am scared. I don't need to be scared because the snake is far. So they don't have, there is only reaction. So there is snake and there is certain emotion and certain action. What the self-consciousness, that it puts this space in the middle. Now, the question is, what happens in that space? So one part of that one part that he talks about is he calls it spatialization of time. So when you actually think about your concepts of time, they are thought of as analogies to space. You start thinking, because space is something that we can grasp a lot more easily. Time is a very difficult concept, and it's generally understood in analogy to space as a dimension, or you're just thinking of it. So that's one thing. Second is that you're doing all kinds of operation on these things, which is reasoning. And those you're doing deliberately, and to the extent to which you're doing it self-consciously, then it is definitely self-conscious. But there are like 2 + 2 = 4. When that comes to your mind, it is reasoning, but it is automatized. So that's the distinction they was trying to make. But
Okay.
So but it is definitely about self-consciousness. That's the heart of it. And once you have this self-consciousness, once you have this mental space, there is a whole range of things you can do with it. And that's what he's talking about. That's really the heart of his mind.
Oh, that cleared up 2 different talks for me. So yeah, thank you. That's very, very clear.
Thanks. Let's see, who else? Roger, you want to continue with other questions that were there?
Yeah, and actually, I can just go right back to Joseph real quick, because you said the ideas of limitations and that how that gives structure to consciousness. And you can think of it with just a couple of questions as to giving you why that creates a structure to consciousness. Like, well, right now, why aren't you perceiving the microscopic? Why aren't you perceiving microwaves? Why can't you see the end of the universe? Why can't you see the end of time? All of those are because of your limitations. And you can actually flip it to the exact opposite. It's like, well, the things that you do see, the things that you are aware of, the things that you can do are also a result of your limitations, right? It's because you're embodied that is what actually frames and creates the framework so that this conscious actually exists. And had you had different limitations, then naturally that consciousness itself would also be different, right? And it's one of the reasons why we can't just assume that all the animals feel and think the exact same way we do. It's like we can presume there's something probably similar, or like in some ways has similarities to us, but the framework is completely different. They've evolved into a different to just to different things, so we can't presume that their consciousness is similar to ours. But yeah, just kind of to highlight that.
Thank you.
And
so Roger, it's getting late, so
yeah.
if you want to take any questions, you can go ahead.
I just wanted to give Mike props because I actually really like the idea that people were just really dumb, so God kept like trying to explain quantum physics to them, and he's like, you know what, okay, look, there was a garden, some people ate a fruit, and I got mad and kicked them out. All right, sorry, it was a mistake. Like I just love how that is just these ancient people are like, I don't know what any of this means. Gwen, I fully agree that people do need to have a much bigger time frame, because I think most people don't even conceptualize their death, let alone conceptualize after their death. And for Maritza, the only point was that, I think you said that Eden was conceptualized as order, but it is more of a balance of order and chaos. It's where it's the ideal middle, right? It's the ideal balance between the two. And then, I think that was, and for Paul, the point that you made about the power structures and that, I haven't heard Peterson mention anything about that, but I could definitely be wrong. But yeah, I think that's most of the questions. If I missed you guys, please let me know.
All right, so I think let's unless anybody has anything burning, let's wrap it up. It's coming on midnight. Folks, great comments. I think this format of going into breakout rooms and then coming and doing Q&A is working better, because what it does is that it enables people to kind of voice out their questions, talk about that, and then come at a much higher level and give their takeaways as well as questions. So wonderful. Thank you very much, Roger and Victor and Claire. This is a great series, and looking forward to the next one on Thursday. Bye.
Thanks.